said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And then the religious leaders began to complain about Jesus because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. They were saying, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he now say, I've come down from heaven? Jesus answered them, do not complain among yourselves. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me, and I will raise that person on the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that you may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the ever lifelong struggles for the people of faith has been this simple reality that we have sought to split between the spiritual world and the physical world. Probably had a lot to do with the following of the Greeks, this idea that somehow our spiritual or mental world was somehow higher than the physical world, and so there was a denigration of the physical. It's this idea that on some level what happens in the world doesn't matter because this is just our earth tent that will pass on, and what happens here really isn't all that important. The problem is, right out the bat, is that is simply slave master theology. How's that way to start a sermon this morning? As pointed as we can make. But here's what I mean by that. It was the Presbyterian Church, the theologians of the Southern Presbyterian Church coming out of Columbia Seminary and elsewhere, who developed a fine theology called the spirituality of the church, that basically said our sole responsibility as people of faith and as those who would minister to people of faith is to make sure that their eternal soul has salvation. The rest is not our problem. And because the Bible is not 100% against slavery, then it's just fine. Now that theology, no one is actually saying it in that way today, but it shows up in lots of places. The idea that somehow if we just believe in Jesus, if we will ourselves to believe in Jesus, we will be saved. And by extension, though it isn't really said, it's sort of understood, it's okay to exploit your workers, to make them work for $2 to $5 an hour and hope that the people that they're serving will give them tips so that they might eat or pay tomorrow's rent. It's okay to take advantage of your neighbors. It's okay to ignore the poor and put immigrant children in cages because I believe in Jesus, I'm saying. It's okay to let collateral damage grow and grow, in fact, just ignore it completely, even though it happens day in and day out, and then claim that we believe in Jesus and our eternal soul will be saved. I know this is theology you've heard somewhere. I mean, not the parts I was mentioning, that's the part that don't get mentioned. Here's the problem. God created us as body, mind, and spirit. All three together, and are intended to be held together. I've never forgotten the witness of a guy by the name of Billy Wright. Billy Wright was a Protestant terrorist in Northern Ireland. He was responsible for at least as many as 55 deaths. But Billy was an interesting character. In his cell block, he would demand that everyone there, all of the other Protestant paramilitaries who had murdered people or blown things up and murdered people, they were all required to go to Bible study. They were not allowed to cuss at all. There was no smoking. There was no drinking. Yes, you could get drinking in these prisons. He didn't allow any of that. In fact, then one day, Somebody got into the prison and put a bullet in the back of his head. There was a high price on his head. As you might imagine, those 55 people had relatives, and those relatives, many of whom were also Catholic, paramilitaries or terrorists. And in his will, he demanded that at his funeral, that we are saved by our faith, not works. And it was really odd. But not so odd, because that is the slave master theology at work. We can act horribly as long as we believe in Jesus. As long as you don't cuss or drink or smoke, that's fine. You can kill your neighbor, because your neighbor's not seen as a full human being. And that's what we see going on in our nation's capital and in Charlottesville. White supremacy wrapped in Christianity, again, as if it was ever stopped. They're gathering under this idea that somehow they're following Jesus. I don't know who that Jesus they're following is. Because the truth is really simple. If it is not rooted in love, if it is not rooted in the love of God that we have seen in the witness of Jesus Christ. See, the problem is a lot of people claim Christianity never bother to read the Bible very much. So then you can make it say whatever you want. And Jesus looks like a white guy with muscles and an AK-47. Anything that is not rooted in the love of God we know in Jesus Christ is not of God. What's happening in the streets is blasphemy, and we as Christians need to stand against it. In some ways, I think that where Jesus is in this story that we read, yes, I'm getting back to the scripture that I actually read, that he's not so much struggling with the folks who are using theology to wipe other people out, but he's struggling with the folks who lay the foundation for folks who can then use it to wipe other people out. Is Dr. Henry Thornwell responsible for the institution of slavery? He's the one that wrote The Spirituality of the Church. I wanted to name it. No, he's not. But he undergirded it, and he bears responsibility. He can say, I didn't own slaves, but that doesn't matter. Did what he say and the policies that were instituted as a result of his thinking create death? Yes. And so he is guilty. So Jesus knows that it's important to deal with the theologians of the day. That's why he's struggling with the religious leadership. And what they were struggling against, the attitude, the ideas, was this idea of certainty. Because these religious leaders understood that they were under the thumb of the Roman Empire. They understood that exploitation was going to happen, and so they had to put a theological stamp on it. And the way to do that is to focus on individual morality and ignore the issues of justice. And that is when fundamentalism rises. As well, I think Jesus is messing with them a little bit because they lack imagination. In fact, if you listen to this passage really carefully, you almost have to laugh and think, Jesus, what are you up to? Because here's the issue. Without imagination, we lack the ability to imagine that the world could be different than it is. And so in order to spark people's imagination, sometimes you have to prod them. You have to provoke them, taking to the streets, blocking highways, creating large puppets and images of leaders they may not like. The truth is, a lot of this passage doesn't make sense in a logical world. What? Eat my flesh. That's where it ends. That is forbidden in the law, Jesus. It's right there in the book. Jesus, we can't eat your flesh. Are you asking us to be cannibals because I know the laws of Moses? He doesn't answer them. He just puts it out there. Let them figure it out. And then he says this language, and again, and again, and again, I am. Now that's not just saying, like me saying, I am Mark, or you are you know, this is not an introduction. This is not Jesus saying, yes, I'm actually yeast and flour. When he says, I am, it is intended to go back to that encounter that Moses had with God at the burning bush. Moses says, who are you? When you send me to these people, what am I supposed to say? And God says, I am. That's not a very satisfactory answer, but that's sermon for Moses for another day. When Jesus says, I am, in the Gospels, it is a theological assertion. And they could not handle it. And so what they say is, but we know his parents. How often does that get used to tear something down? We know that guy. We went to high school with him. You're already filling in the gaps with folks from St. Louis, aren't you? Who've made it and left. Who is this Jesus to claim he is? We know Joseph and Mary. Again, he's prodding them. And this idea of eating and never be hungry again, I've had some big meals, but they don't last more than 12 hours. I get hungry pretty quick. So this idea of when we eat and we get hungry again, and so they don't seem to fit together. And again, Jesus then says bread from heaven. But as we know, in St. Louis, bread comes from the bread company. So Jesus is doing this push around a little bit. But here's my favorite one that almost doesn't make sense, right? What people say today, the majority, is you have to believe in Jesus. And Jesus says that here. But he also says something else. Only if God brings it. You can only believe in me if God brings you. Those two things don't seem to fit together. Now, I will tell you, there's ways to twist that around and make it make sense and say that there's no paradox whatsoever. But there's still a paradox there. There's a struggle. There's some tension going on there. It's as if it's a reminder to us. See, we're Reformed theologians, so we look at that and go, it makes perfect sense. And here's where. I'm smiling as I say that. The sense that we have made out of it is this. And I kind of like it, because it keeps us humble. Right? If I can believe in Jesus, then I can save myself. If it is my decision to believe, then why did Jesus need to go to the cross? All I need to do is believe. That works really well in this idea of American ingenuity and bootstrap theology. I did it. Yeah, we love Jesus, but I did it. I don't have to read the Bible. I just believe in him. That's all I need to do. This idea, then, that is intended to keep us humble. This is where greater minds than I have said, basically, this is idea that if you have come to faith, you didn't do it. So you shouldn't be prideful in it. You shouldn't point fingers at other people. You shouldn't look at others and think, well, they're not saved. I know Christians don't do that, ever. Generally, Presbyterians don't, because we're a little bit more liberal about all of that. But the truth is, there's this sense of gratitude that comes out of it. If I have a sense of saving faith through Jesus Christ, if I want to learn and grow and follow this crazy itinerant preacher who fed people without exception, who welcomed people, who healed people, and talked about love and then was executed for it, if we choose that, then we're grateful in the sense that if that's feeding us, we're called to feed others, not just spiritually, but actually with food. That's important. Because Jesus feeds people first, and then talks about spiritual food. I had the opportunity to work in a ministry in Atlanta, St. Luke's Training and Counseling Center. And the biggest part of what they had there, while they provided resources, because people were streaming and still streaming to Atlanta, because it is the golden city, everybody wants to go there, you'll be able to get a job. The truth is, that's not true. And so their homeless population, when I was in seminary, was, they would admit to 25, they think those numbers were more like 40,000 people living on the streets. And so, and then they didn't want them downtown, because, it was revitalized, so you got to get those people out of the way. But this one ministry, who'd been there since the 1970s, the first thing they did when you got there for help was they just gave you food. And I'm talking like, we got to eat there occasionally a couple of times, and it was so much food, you would not believe it, because they had this cook. I know this is sort of digressing, but I need to give him credit. He was a Navy chef. He'd retired, and he made sure that everybody who came through that door had enough fat and those soups and food that folks would not have to worry about their next meal. And then after that, they would worry about getting them clothing, and then after that, trying to find them housing, and then whatever other services they need. And then after that, if they were inclined, they were invited, not required, to go to a worship service. So they got fed first, and you know what happened? Some of the people that came and ate and got services didn't go to the worship service. Now, some of the other groups that supported this ministry sometimes were upset by that. You should make them hear the message first. And their response was, well, Jesus fed people with real food first, and then fed them with spiritual food. Because it's awfully hard sometimes to concentrate when you're hungry. I know that's what happens when the sermon goes on a little long, and we haven't had lunch yet. So, back to where we were on this idea of belief. It's an invitation, and then we find a sense of humility in the fact that we've been given this knowledge and then called to feed in the same way. So here's Jesus messing around with all of our neat categories of how it means to be church and do church and follow Jesus. Because actually Jesus doesn't say anything about being or doing church, but that's sort of how we extrapolate that. So what is Jesus actually up to in these passages? If this dichotomy, this paradox of these things, and the listeners are going, Jesus, you know in the Bible it says you can't, What Jesus is ultimately doing is challenging a closed system of thinking. If you know a system really well, you can make it do all sorts of things. And Jesus is saying the system of interpretation of the religious leadership of that day had gotten it wrong. This closed way of looking at the world is a way of seeing the world and about what will come next and about what is possible, basically through what we think we can manage. We believe that on some level, if we can get things down to a neat system, we can manage all the outcomes. But here's the thing about life. It is messy. It never follows a pattern. In human behavior, we cannot figure out all that well, though marketing have done a wonderful job. But here's the problem. We have heard, as followers of Jesus, in this place, for the most part, we have heard all the stories about Jesus. We know about God's love. We have done Christmas so much, we can tell the story in our sleep. At Easter, we know the tomb was empty. And we have created more committees than the world will ever know. And we have building issues, and we live on the Del Mar Divide. We know how St. Louis works, so we know what to expect. There cannot be any changes beyond what we can see. And we're not alone in this. We are part of a grand tradition that understands there is a way the world works. And when we run into encounters like this with Jesus, what we have to hear is not that we're on Jesus' side, but that we're most likely the religious leaders. Because we've been in it for so long. The people who are drawn to Jesus are folks who have been left out of institutions like ours. Not Westminster necessarily, but yes, but the Presbyterian Church, the church itself. And then into this despairing certainty that permeates the religious community, we create a laundry list of why things cannot happen. And in the face of it, we don't really want it to change because on some level, it works for us. And then Jesus says, because if it didn't work for us, we'd change it, right? And in the face of this certainty of the things we like, Jesus says, I am. I am, not you. Did you get that subtext there? Jesus says, I am, not your institutions. I am, not your traditions. I am, not your personal preferences. I am. So everything you do has to be rooted in what I was up to, what I want, and so you kind of have to read it to know what that's all about. And when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, its intent that came down from heaven is pointing us back to the manna story. Because that's what they called it, the bread of heaven. It came down from heaven that fed us, even though it was already there on the ground, they just didn't know they could eat it. And once they did, then they found out that sustenance was right in front of them, more than they could ever imagine, abundance. The idea that there is enough, more than we ever actually need to be the people of God, God has called us to be in this place and on this corner. We say in our baptism, Our baptism is sufficient for our call. We have enough. Yes, but we say we know Mary and Joseph's son. We know his mother and father, and now we've been doing this a long time, and this is just the way it is. And then Jesus says, come. If you're hungry, there's another way. If you thirst for possibility of new life, and the possibility of being something bigger than yourself, and bigger than something that we can imagine. When Jesus uses this language of hunger and thirst, we have to take just a moment to recognize that he's pointing very specifically to two other places in the Bible, or two other places that we need to notice. One is the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, honor or blessed will be those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and justice, for they will be filled. We don't know how. We don't have a plan. We don't necessarily have a strategy, but we know that Jesus says that in the thirst, in the seeking for those things, for justice and righteousness, that there will be filling. It may not come in the way that we expect. We might not actually like the taste all that well, but we will be filled. Because apparently after days, manna was really boring for the folks. That's, again, another sermon for another day. But then, when he talks about thirst and hunger, we have to go back to Isaiah. Again, it's another story. The prophets are always about pushing our imaginations, forcing us to imagine that the world is possible. Because here's what the prophet says from God to this group of people who are struggling in their lives. Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you that have no money, come buy and eat. Now, how do you buy something if you don't have any money? That's my editorial, not the Bible's. And then it says, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread? And you labor for that which does not satisfy. Paradoxes written into these texts that remind us that there is more possible, that what we can see isn't the only thing that is possible. And paradoxes in our manageable worlds just don't make sense. Because if we're blinded by what is simply manageable, what is possible, then we are not using the whole gift that God has given us. We're not using to God's Word, we're not listening to God's Word with our intelligence that needs to be infused with imagination. With imagination, fed by love and imagination. If that sounds familiar to some of you, yes, I was actually taking that directly from what we do when we ordain elders and ministers in the life of the church. But I think it's a call that we all need to be reminded of. When we ordain them and we lay hands on them, or we charge them to use their intelligence, imagination, and love in their work. And it's almost, in some ways, I think, like a trinity of Christian discipleship, a three-legged stool, if you will, although we don't really use those a whole lot anymore. So, I think what Jesus is trying to do to those folks who were curious, I mean, they wouldn't have been listening if they weren't curious, but they were arguing with him, and he had to help them imagine that something was different. And he was, I believe, trying to get them to use more than just their intelligence. Root your ministry in imagination, intelligence, and love. And without one of those, everything will fall apart. The good news is that we can survive on living bread, the bread of heaven, if we can imagine that it is possible, and then use our significant gifts of intelligence and love to figure out the details. It is possible if we are able to imagine a faith that is not confined to the inside of a building, or to the troubles of the day, or to our outlook, or to what's going on in Washington, or the next tweet that comes down, the next crisis that comes down. We are not bound by that. We can say no to the troubles of the world and yes to new life if we seek the living bread, which is found in community, found with others who are seeking for justice and righteousness. It's found in the grand stories of our tradition that have always said no to the ways of power politics and yes to the ways of life. If we're feeding ourselves on that and feeding others, we will make a difference. That's our call. We may not be able to end parades, we may not be able to set national policy, but you never know what can happen. When people of faith and goodwill who are hungry for justice and righteousness join together, we might just be surprised. No one could have imagined the empty tomb, but it happened. Amen.